Let's see. Hey, and we are live. What's up, wrestling fans? I am Doug.
And I'm Kevin.
So we are back to our regularly scheduled programming after what seems like weeks on end of pay-per-views. My goodness, what's happening, Kevin?
Oh man, it's been well, what's happening, Doug, is kind of a lot, right? I was excited to get back to a normal broadcast, and we do have a very special topic, folks, that we have been promoting for a few weeks, and we're definitely going to get to that because we're here to celebrate the 1 year anniversary of AEW, hits, misses, that sort of thing. We're eager to talk about it, and we want you to join in with us. But as always, we start with our opening bell, which is our news segment, and I just want to apologize in advance because we, and Doug and I, love talking about this wonderful, ridiculous world of wrestling. Unfortunately, where we start with news, wrestling news anymore is about, Doug, it's about as depressing as the real news.
It is. I mean, for a sport that's as much entertainment as is sport, it's wrestling. It's not sports entertainment, regardless of what certain producers of this wonderful sport call it. It's to get our minds off of things. And with Britt Rest, let's just jump into this, man. Britt Rest just exploded over the last week with their allegations, and what we were talking about right before we went live. It's become almost it's not almost, it has become a global scandal as such. I guess it's wrestling's dirty little secret with all the abuse that happens throughout. I don't even know where to start with this. Well, I guess we start with Britt Rest because that's where it first took off from, but goodness.
Yeah, you don't know what we're talking about, folks. And again, we do have our main event topic we'll get to, and I apologize that we're going to have a really hard transition, but we promise we'll get there. What we're discussing here in the news, though, and that will continue to follow, unfortunately, is a reckoning. Abuse allegations are being leveled against those in the industry, and it's at this point, Doug, it engulfs every major company. WWE, AEW, Impact, NWA are all affected. Of the wrestlers who are alleged to have been engaging in this kind of abuse and misconduct, a large number of them began their careers on the British pro wrestling circuit. That's what Doug was referring to.
Yeah, and I didn't know until recently, that the British wrestling circuit is actually just called British Rest. It's commonly known as British Rest amongst those in the know, which I apparently wasn't in the know.
And, apparently there was a lot of people in the know in the business. And in many ways, this is, sort of the Me Too movement hitting professional wrestling a little late. And obviously, everyone is entitled to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. But we also know that those who make allegations need to be heard and taken seriously. So what we can hope for in this ugly time, with obviously so much in the way in the world right now of people not being kind to one another, is that everything is fully vetted, investigated, and those who are guilty of what they are accused of are brought to justice and handled accordingly. And Doug, that acts apparently. Those lines seem to be clearer around some people than they are others, and the axe has already fallen in a couple of instances. I don't know if you want to get into a few of those.
This is very true. I've got Wrestle Talk, the WrestleTalk.com brought up on my screen here because they've done a really good job being a British wrestling based organization that follows the wrestling scene globally, but being based out of Britain. They have pretty up to date stories here about the speaking out, which is what it's a hashtag speaking out, which is what Kevin was talking about before, where it parallels the Me Too movement from a while back. But I mean, wrestlers it goes from MLW, Progress, NXT UK, Matt Riddle, Jack Gallagher was actually released from WWE. There are issues with people accusing Matt Riddle It is, the list just goes on, and it's truly dumbfounding. After our live show, I will go back and edit our description down below so that anybody who's interested to do a deep dive into this can do it, because this is an hours long show on
It
end
is.
if we were to just cover this. But sufficient to say, there is apparently a seedy underbelly that I was completely unaware of that takes place within wrestling, and the women involved in it have suffered, it appears, quite a bit. I mean, it just really
And,
goes, it boggles my mind that we have to say be nice to each other and don't do these things, but apparently we have to say be nice to each other and don't do these things.
and again, as we mentioned, that obviously everyone has the presumption of innocence until
Absolutely.
proven guilty.
Absolutely.
However, we need to point out that once these allegations began to become made, that there were a ton of male and female wrestlers, both in the industry, who have stepped forward to say, yes, this kind of thing needs to stop, as if it was a not so hidden secret. It isn't just some lone accusation that you could say, well, they may be making it up, or let's wait and see. This is multiple allegations against multiple individuals, some of which may prove to be true, some of which may prove to be not. But there's certainly, where there's smoke, there's fire. There's enough here that there's some things going on. And that's why we can hope that, in the instance of where you see Jack Gallagher already released, obviously there was enough evidence there that WWE didn't wait around to figure it out. They knew that they had something going on. They got rid of him. David
And,
Lagana, who has been
oh,
a big
about
big
that.
person in wrestling for decades and was the vice president of the National Wrestling Association, he has stepped down after allegations of sexual misconduct. So those are just the ones that have currently been had the axe fall on them. AEW has announced that Jimmy Havoc is going to be receiving treatment for mental health and substance abuse issues, and that those issues may be what led him to issues in regards to the allegations made against him, and that they're going to investigate those when he finishes his substance abuse treatment. So again, there is not a single federation in this industry that isn't untouched by this. And obviously this is an extremely serious matter. It does range, I guess, Doug, we should say that not all these allegations are the same. In cases like Jimmy Havoc, he's being accused of mental abuse, whereas Jordan Devlin has a girlfriend who was accusing him of physical abuse,
Right.
showing
And
bruises and things. In the case of Velveteen Dream, something was mentioned here before, further individuals have come across saying that he takes advantage of underage girls. So all of this is across the board, but all squarely in the genre of inappropriate at worst, at best, I mean,
okay,
and
you're
at
right.
worst criminal. And hopefully those that, again, that investigations prove are guilty, not only lose their careers, but find themselves justly punished in a court of law.
Right. And just to contrast, we talked about Gallagher, and I mentioned Matt Riddle. Is I mean, WWE immediately cut ties with Gallagher. So again, one can only presume that WWE has, there's some sort of mountain of evidence that would cause them to pull the trigger there and go ahead and get rid of him. Where Riddle's released a press release that talks about the allegations by this independent wrestler, this female, and this comes straight from Riddle's lawyer, not from the WWE, but it talks about, well, I'll just read the statement. The allegations by this independent female performer are completely false and another attempt to harass and humiliate Mr. and Mrs. Riddle and try to tarnish their reputation in the community. We have been aware of this for the performer for the last 2 years, and this performer stalking the Riddle family. In 2019, our firm had drafted a pleading against this performer to seek an injunction for cyber stalking in a circuit court for Orange County, Florida. So that's an official statement from Riddle's lawyer there. And again, I think WWE, like, and reasonably so, with most of the other companies involved, especially large companies like WWE, AEW, they're looking into it on an individual basis and dealing accordingly with what they feel accordingly. So
And
we're
you have to. I mean, people,
absolutely
you want people to step up, because for too long we've always the victims are the ones that aren't believed. to begin with. The burden
Yes.
of proof gets put on them, and that sometimes forces silence, which is obviously the wrong thing. At the same time, like we saw with the Me Too movement, all these bad individuals, from Matt Lauer to Weinstein to Bill,
Right.
I mean, they all got outed and punished as they should, and yet the opportunity created itself for someone like a Connor Oberst, for example, to get accused, and people presume him just as guilty as the others because this was what was happening in the world. And then his accuser later recanted, saying she made the whole thing up. So it is possible that somebody will take advantage of, and unfortunately, it is for those who are serious victims of abuse. You're doing those individuals no favors if you are making up allegations against someone else at that time to try to take part in someone else's story. So we want the accusers to be heard, and we want the accused to have a fair hearing, and then we want the guilty to be punished. And I guess that.
So here's something you're talking about Gallagher, David Poole mentions. So, well, there's clearly, if Gallagher is actually admitting to his allegations against him, I'm certain that's why WWE went ahead and let him go. So that's interesting. I haven't read that, but thanks for the info, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. I have to presume that with Dave Lagana voluntarily stepping down from his position, that it must be something similar, that he don't want him looking in his closet, or that he knows he's guilty, or otherwise he would claim his innocence like Matt Riddle and go on. So we're not here to point like who in this group is actually guilty and who isn't. We will keep you informed. We'll treat it like a news story and treat it with the respect that it deserves as a news story. And we'll keep week to week. We'll let you know what the latest developments is on this, because there are future developments. This is just the start.
This is unfortunately going to be a long, ugly road for wrestling to weather this, and hopefully everybody's better on the other side of this for having had to endure it, and justice will be served for those.
And obviously, if this is a problem that's been hidden in plain view, then it needs to come out. It's belated to come out, and so we're happy that, as ugly as it is, that if it's happening, it's better that the world knows it's happening, so that they can hold those guilty accountable.
So I'm ready to leave the wrestling news behind, unless you have anything else, Kevin. Let's
let me do a few quick hits.
Sure.
I told everybody it's going to be a hard transition. So since it has been a few weeks since we've had our normal format, real quick, Paul Heyman is out. He is no longer the writer on Raw. He'll continue as an on-air talent. He was put on as the writer and producer of the Raw broadcast at the same time Eric Bischoff was put in charge of SmackDown. Eric Bischoff lasted a month. Paul lasted a year, which is surprising to some people that Paul Heyman could last a year under Vince McMahon. But Bruce Pritchard is now in charge of both entities. Ratings were down, and so now they're pinning that on Paul. There are rumors that AJ Styles actually switched to SmackDown because he had problems with Heyman. Who knows? New Japan Pro Wrestling is the first to welcome back fans. The promotion's back up and running. They're doing the New Japan Cup that had recently been canceled. Current shows are taking place in front of no fans, but the finals will take place July the 11th at Osaka-jo Hall, and that will be in front of an audience. So they will be the first wrestling company in the world to welcome back an audience at a third capacity. Ring of Honor's back in July. They have not been touring during the entire pandemic, so they're not any word yet on what form they're taking place, but they'll be back on the air. And then this past week, WWE canceled TV tapings because a developmental wrestler tested positive for COVID, and all talent and on-site employees had to be tested. And as a result of all of this, Kevin Owens has decided to stay home. So now Kevin Owens joins Roman Reigns and Sami Zayn, who earlier decided that until there is testing or some sort of security around their safety, they weren't going to participate. Supposedly there is nothing going to be held against these wrestlers for doing so, but now we got at least 3 major WWE stars that will not be participating because there's still no handle on this pandemic, folks. This is another news story that we're going to keep following because it affects the world of wrestling.
Yeah, this is true. This, as states who've opened back up and begin to try and jumpstart their economies and open back up, we're starting to see spikes, especially in certain vacation spots. And Florida is one of those vacation spots, especially where we see AEW and all of the WWE operations coming out of right now. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out.
We're going to keep following that story for you too. But Doug, now I'm ready for the main event. Let's get started with some good news.
I am so ready to talk about a subject I truly love. From
Dynamite
the
Doug has been born. Doug was waiting on this. I think this is why he wanted to create this show to begin with, is for
just
this
so,
very night.
just so I could talk about AEW all the time.
So AEW, they came on the scene and they had their first pay-per-view branded as an AEW pay-per-view back in May of last year. So we just hit the 1 year mark of the company, and there is no doubt about it that they have changed the entire wrestling landscape. So if you're an AEW fan, join in the discussion. Tell us what you like, what you agree with, and or not about what we're about to say. But we're going to go over first. Let's start talking about the many positives. And you're right, Doug. We could spend the whole hour talking about the positives of AEW. But
Absolutely. So
I'd say first, you go ahead.
So here's what I did. I made a list of positives, and like we were talking about right before we went on the air, because Kevin and I do not really talk about our shows ahead of time, other than to put together a topic, and we try and keep it fresh, and we'll get each other's hot takes really. And then honestly, a couple of minutes before we go live, we meet up right in the basically green room right before we go live and talk, and to get a handle on how things are going to go. But we were talking beforehand. I stopped at 5 hits because I could go on and on and on and on about AEW. Yeah, Kevin knows this, and anybody who's watched the show for any amount of time knows this as well. But so out of the gate, I'm saying that it's a definitely hit for AEW, that they have established themselves as a legit primetime network alternative to the WWE. That's a plus, because competition is always good.
And you took, I mean, we knew we'd have some of these in common, because to me,
Right.
that's the obvious one. That's number one on my list too. It's competition, and competition is good for everyone. And when WCW folded in 2001, WWE has basically been unchecked as the only promotion that really mattered. There were number twos for a while. Impact had a show that was on prime time opposite them, that didn't, get much traction outside of that first week of a Monday Night War that really wasn't. Ring of Honor would be a distant number two at one point in time, but there hasn't been a strong number two until AEW. And because of that, Doug, Ring of Honor is stronger, New Japan strong. I mean, right now, it's the healthiest the wrestling landscape has been since at least 2001.
So this is true. How do you want to do this? Do we want to do all hits or bounce back and forth between hits and misses? Because that segues great into one of my misses for AEW.
You do it. Maybe we do go a hit and a miss. I actually have more misses, even though I'm way more positive on AEW. I wanted to be as critical as I could. So let's hear your miss.
As did I, but you're just talking about the other promotions and strengthening them. How it segues great into a miss that I had in here, which is AEW had this promise of the inclusion of other promotions like AAA, the Chinese promotion, which I have it listed as ONW, but I am not sure that is correct. I need to pull that up.
That's right. I think it is.
Yeah, right. But there's that potential there to create more. I know there are some issues where a lot of top guys from the Bullet Club walked out of New Japan. It was going to take some time to mend those bridges. And then we also have Marty Scurll, who's a member of the Elite, who chose to stay with ROH and not jump over to AEW when his contract there was up. But for the most part, we have not seen that inclusion that I would like to see of other promotions, because I can see a loose alliance of AAA, MLW, ROH, New Japan, NWA, Impact, these players, a lot of players that you just mentioned, using AEW as almost like the old school territory days, when you had these champions moving around from territory to territory. You had the NWA champion moving around, and I can see an atmosphere like that, because there's so much about AEW that reminds me of those old school territory days, and all the great things that when WCW was good. I see that in AEW now. But one of those things I haven't seen is the inclusion of those other promotions, which it wasn't going to be a staple. It was never going to be a staple of the company. And I understand from a business point of view, it's not good to continually promote somebody else's promotion, especially if it's another North American promotion. But I think there could be more inclusion and more of an alliance to push wrestling forward.
That's one I didn't have, Doug. I mean, but you're right. At first, they did have these alliances that made you think that it would be, if we all band together, we could really take on WWE. Obviously, AEW is able to, be a strong number two, and they are still number two. They don't pretend any otherwise. They know that. But when you see Ring of Honor and NWA working together, and some of these, Impact has a relationship with AAA, Ring of Honor has a relationship with New Japan and the NWA. So, there's obviously alliances out there. They will talk about the other products. This past
that is a beautiful
showed
thing.
Up on AEW, and they referred to all the work he did in NWA. So that's something you'll never hear WWE do.
Yes,
but yeah, that would be good to see them work together more. Again, that's not one I had. My first negative, Doug, and please don't take this as a Dynamite Doug slam.
It's about me, isn't it?
No, but there is an AEW elitism, and NXT once suffered from this.
It's baked into the title of the federation. You can't get away from
that. Is true. They call them out on it. It's more than that. It's for all the good they've done, and there is more good, way more good than there is negatives. NXT once suffered, though, again from this problem that no matter how good NXT was, there were some that thought it was beyond criticism. Mm-hmm. And it's even worse with AEW, because at the end of the day, NXT was still part of the greater WWE universe. And while AEW gets just praise for the many, many, many things it's done right, it too often gets a pass on things that I think WWE would actually be crucified for, because some folks think that AEW can do no wrong. And again, that maybe that's a criticism as much of the fan base as it, not Dynamite Doug, because he's got a long list of criticisms. But I think I know what I'm saying, because I used to feel that with NXT, that as much as I loved it, nothing is perfect.
Absolutely.
And, AEW isn't perfect either, but they're getting a lot right. So that's my first negative. You want to go back to a positive?
Absolutely. Let me jump back to a positive here. And this was probably on your list too, but a positive, one of the hits I'm seeing with AEW is their willingness and their ability to create new stars and not just relying on the old guard. And it's not a rehash of Impact when Impact was TNA and when they would just pull everybody they could from WWE in order to try and create this illusion of the Monday Night Wars when WCW would pull big stars over. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with that to a certain degree, because it goes back to the old territory days. People jump from territory to territory all the time back in the day. But WCW and Impact just became bloated with all of these, I don't want to call them rejects, but all these WWE stars that they would pull into their company, and they weren't really doing anything new or anything original or anything fresh. AEW has went out of their way to create new stars in MJF, Darby Allin, Britt Baker, Hikaru Shida, Nyla Rose,
Cassidy,
I could, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Orange Cassidy, I could go on, and I'm sure you could too, but I do nod to AEW for taking the shot and making these stars, elevating them, because I think we see time and time again, a lot of indie wrestlers that we may not necessarily know, but we know of, and we get to see them more when they hit NXT. But then when they get to the main roster, they get lost in the shuffle. And I see a push with the mainstream guys, or the indie guys, going into the mainstream here, and all the new kids, and I really, really like that.
Doug, I had this on my list as a positive too, the creating of new stars. It is a tricky thing, though. If we are not your average wrestling fans. Most people watching us on YouTube probably aren't just a casual wrestling fan who watches it if they happen across it. So we may have known MJF. I first saw him on like MLW or something, but a lot of folks are getting the national stage for the first time in front of mainstream audiences. A mainstream audience that is just casual, though, needs that mix, and AEW has been great at finding that mix. You have to have a familiar face for people to know it's big time, and they have, Chris Jericho. You might, if they were familiar with Jack Swagger in his old incarnation, or Dean Ambrose in his old incarnation. Yeah, Cody Rhodes. I mean,
Yeah.
these are names that people would see like, oh, what are these guys doing on a different show? And then they get exposed to Orange Cassidy, MJF. But you can't have it all
Mm-hmm.
one way or the other. And it's not easy. If you're not careful, you put the old guys out there to like say, hey, look, here's some names that give us legitimacy. If you're not careful, you become Impact, and it's not names you have, it's has-beens, and you look like a dated promotion trying to recreate the past. The new stars they've created, I never, even as deep as I think I dive into wrestling, you and I have talked before, I had no idea who Orange Cassidy was.
Right.
I had not seen him on any other promotion other than some YouTube clips. And so they've done a really great job at their scouting and finding these diamonds in the rough when they're really young and getting them in front of a big crowd and turning them into stars.
And if we're going with misses, I can jump in here talking about, because these make great segues, which I didn't realize when I was lining these out. But the way we're talking about them, they segue great into each other. If we're looking at another miss for AEW, it's the inclusion, and this is a very specific. An incredibly specific complaint of mine, but the inclusion of an old WWE storyline, it's what, like 10 years old, to get more eyes on the product with Mike Tyson and Chris Jericho. I mean, this is a criticism of mine because you have Mike Tyson, a star in his sport. You have Chris Jericho, an amazing talent in the ring and behind the broadcast desk, on the mic, just all around, even with Fozzy. If you're into that kind of music, Chris Jericho is an all around talent there. So and both household names, I would think, at this point, as far as wrestling goes, because like you say, people know who Chris Jericho is. So you have these two guys. They did have like this 10, 12 years ago, brief storyline in a WWE ring. Tyson's a wrestling fan. Great. Tyson and Jericho apparently friends or whatever, but let's get them together. Let's cook something new up. Let's do something new. Let's get something to get some, maybe Sammy Guevara or Santana Ortiz over with some of Mike Tyson's, favored wrestlers or something, and have them in another role, instead of having them go head to head, which we're probably going to see at All Out, eventually this year, or some other AEW pay-per-view that's going to continue to build if they don't drop it. But I mean, they've already started that ball rolling, and I think they could have just done so much better with those two guys than trying to rehash a 10-year-old WWE storyline. And for that, shame on you, AEW.
And that most people honestly wouldn't remember. I consider myself a pretty heavy consumer of professional wrestling, and I had to be reminded of it. So if it wasn't an immediate like, oh man, that relates back to that big thing, it's probably not worth rehashing.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, and again, you've got I get it. You want to bring in outside talent that is recognizable to bring maybe somebody's eyes to it that's going to follow Tyson into it that maybe doesn't necessarily follow wrestling. But I think there are better ways to do that. I mean, I apparently had a bunch of not WWE, but MMA guys with him when his squad came out to interact with Jericho, which I didn't know any of them, but there's more eyes for people who know that sport to watch that, and it just could have went another direction. I mean, you could have put a Hager over, with all those MMA guys there. I mean, really, he's a legit MMA fighter as well. So, I mean, you could have put him over with something. But
you just want to see a Hager get put over.
Hey, Cousin Jack for the win, man.
So, Doug, my next one, and it pains me to say it as a negative, but he's the greatest announcer of all time, but JR isn't the same man. I know this started somewhat during his time in New Japan, where he often would seem maybe a little lost, cranky a lot of times.
A little disengaged in the product too, I think.
Yes, surprisingly little about the talent at times. I will say he has improved a lot since AEW's first months. Those first couple of months were a little tough because I love me some Jim Ross. I think he's the best to ever do it. And while I still loved hearing him, there were times that I was embarrassed for him. Every now and then he can still fall back into these bad habits. It has definitely improved in 2020 compared to most of 2019. I think, though, and this could be another miss, is that the 3-man announce team is a format that JR hated on Raw. back in his WWE days. I think it's one that he's always been outspoken against, that there's too many people out there. I think that it doesn't do him any favors if you perhaps paired him with Excalibur and do like the old Nitro days where you switch it up halfway through or something, or week to week. Like one week you get Tony and Taz, and the next week you get Excalibur and JR. It might be a little better for him. But yeah, it's a slight negative, and then that I think it's improving. But sometimes JR doesn't lead as good as maybe he definitely would have in his prime.
Yeah. It's not on my list, but I totally understand and do agree with what you're saying there. I think JR has picked up from, I think there was a definite lull there, like when he was announcing some New Japan. I mean, there was maybe just a disconnect from the product, just really not engaged in what was going on. And maybe I would like to think that Tony Khan and his little indie promotion has lit a fire under JR, and that he's coming back around now. But, and I do love the inclusion of Excalibur. Excalibur is excellent behind the announce desks.
Absolutely excellent. You want to give a positive, or you want me to throw one out there?
Let me give another positive. I got a few here.
I know you do, Dynamite.
So, and of course, with two of the executive vice presidents being tag team specialists, we really expected nothing else than a focus on a tag team division, a legit focus on a tag team division. I mean, it's no secret, and this goes way back, that I love tag teams and I love stables. And, with the Elite, we have a tag team in the stable of the company. But, it is great that the Bucks have never put themselves over. But I do love the focus on tag teams. There's something about that camaraderie, and these are legit tag teams too, not just guys randomly thrown together. I mean, you have like brothers, friends that are tight, like SCU, Jurassic Express, the best friends, Orange Cassidy.
Yeah.
WWE goes, it seems, out of their way to just randomly throw people together and see if things work. But and then we talked about this recently, and then they would just totally destroy their entire division with squash matches with one on two. And it happened again, I realized, on NXT this week when we had Io Shirai come out at the end and just totally destroy the women's tag team champions, to claim that this is her NXT, not theirs. But in doing so, she put a quick little beat down on not only the tag team champions, but also one of the women's champions of SmackDown. But, and maybe that's to get Io Shirai over, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of a division, which I think WWE is good at.
I didn't have I missed it.
I just popped it up on the screen.
We don't call him Dynamite Doug around here, David, without good reason. I'm actually surprised that he had a list of negatives at all. So I was ready to give him all kinds of heck. So I'm more excited about his negatives, honestly, than I am his positive.
I do really need to change my graphic to Dynamite Doug, don't I?
I'm gonna give a positive, and then I'm gonna switch right into a negative if I can.
Go.
So, diversity. By far, AEW has proven themselves to be the most progressive league in the history of professional wrestling. Doug and I have talked about this and be looking for it. Well, when we release a schedule for the month of July, we are going to have a July-August timeframe. We have a show we're going to schedule around the history of race and equality in professional wrestling, because it's rather shameful that it's taken us so long to be as inclusive as other forms of entertainment in the country as a whole. But hopefully, that's a topic we can dig deep into. But AEW is going to be one of those examples of how to progress us into a 2020 mindset between openly gay wrestlers, trans wrestlers, the company making statements about homophobia and sexist chants not being calling folks out, kicking them out, fans and things, for bad behavior to certain superstars because of hate speech and language and things that they just won't tolerate because you're not welcome here. They've definitely shown themselves in a way that has never really been so openly done in the past in professional wrestling, that we're not going to feed into those types of stereotypes. That it to me is such a huge positive in this day and age to be able to do. I said I'll dovetail into a negative because I have diversity on my my positives and my negatives. So for all they have done in regards to having meaningful programs for some of these wrestlers I just spoke of that may be gay or trans or any sort of different, we don't have, surprisingly, in AEW right now, too many strong booking of black athletes. If you look at WWE, when you have, Bobby Lashley, New Day as big stars, Ricochet as an upcoming star. I mean, you have Sonny Kiss, you have Private Party. These are guys that don't win a whole lot. I was surprised when I started thinking about it that I couldn't name a prominent, black athlete in AEW right now. And I think that that's maybe a blind spot that they have to know that they have, and hopefully that's one of the things that they'll work on fixing. But they need some more diversity in that regard on the roster.
I do not disagree with that at all. Actually, I have a very similar. This is one I was talking about. There's a positive and a negative, which deals with the diversity, because I wanted to talk about Nyla Rose, because I think it is great that they have a openly transgender female on their roster. But I think they could have done more with her. I think they could have also, because this is where it eventually landed as a negative for me, and I got to go to my notes because I made notes about it, because it was difficult for me to call this as a miss. And I pulled some stuff from a wiki here about how Rose became the first openly transgender wrestler in history to sign with a major American promotion in 2019. And she's also the first trans wrestler to win a title in a major American promotion when she won the World Women's Championship. But then and I guess it's for the best part, because I don't remember where I heard it, but there was some promoter pushing that they push the her trans identity as one of her major heel points, which I think that's ridiculous, and that would have been terrible. But I think they could have done more to push her as a babyface and do more inclusive and education at that point and open up a really good conversation now. However, at the end of the day, I think this is one of those damned if you do, damned if they don't, because if they'd went too far, they could have been seen as pandering. If they didn't go far enough, the people are going to do what I'm doing and say, well, they didn't go far enough. So I think overall, even though I mark it as a miss, it's a definite plus, because it goes back to the inclusion and diversity that you're talking about. But I don't know.
It's a mixed bag in that they're doing some things that no one's done before, but you're right. It's a sensitive issue that you have to handle sensitively and how it's portrayed, and they're figuring that out, and they're not always getting it right, but they are making some attempts, and there's still a chance that maybe down the road that they can repackage Nyla Rose and do exactly what you were saying, because I think that would be something that would be seen universally as a positive for the industry.
Absolutely.
I got another miss here, Doug.
Do it. Let's hear it.
Too much 50-50 booking. Oh. So I like the idea of win-loss records. It's a great concept. In execution, it highlights a problem that AEW is not just taken from WWE, but it's always been a problem in wrestling. And that's too much even Steven booking, people having to get their heat back or what have you. There's exceptions. There's guys like, Moxley or Cody Rhodes or MJF on one extreme of having a really impressive win-loss record. On the other hand, you have guys like, Nakazawa or the Librarian, guys who have no wins at all.
Brandon Cutler.
Everybody else, though, falls into that middle category of you look at their win-loss records and they look like, he's 6-4 or he's 3-6, and it's right. Maybe over time when the records will make folks stand out a little different, but right now maybe it's still too new or what have you, where they only have one show a week and not everybody's always on it. It's slow to see these things change, but if you just look at when Mike Tyson came out, you mentioned him earlier. We came out in boxing, and you saw his number of wins to losses and how many knockouts he got, you instantly knew, even if you didn't know who Mike Tyson was, wow. Without a few exceptions I mentioned before, you look at most wrestlers on AEW and their win-loss records, and you just think, he's probably okay just looking at the record alone. So I'm not sure they're quite there yet and making that work in a way that works for them.
So that's really interesting because I just pulled up the AEW rankings, and they have, these are the rankings as of June 17th, 2020. You got MJF, who's 6-0 for the year, and then right behind him we've got the Murder Hawk, who's 6-1. Then Brody Lee 5-1. Kenny Omega 4-0, and Jericho 2-1 for the year for individual. But yeah, at the top of the list you've got Moxley, who's 13-0, and Cody, who's 12-1. But when it does get to some serious 50-50 booking is with everybody in the women's division that's in the top 5, other than Nyla Rose, who's 6-2, Statlander's 4-4, Penelope Ford's 4-3, Britt Baker 4-4. So there is.
And I don't have the tag teams in front of me, Doug, but I'm going to say if you're looking at it, the tag teams are probably just as bad as the women's division.
Let's see. Best Friends 9-3, Natural Nightmare 5-0, Private Party 4-2. Dark Order 6-0, and that's going with Evil. They're considering Dark Order 6-0, Evil Uno and Stu Grayson, and then the Bucks are 2-2 for this year, and the champions are Omega and Hangman. They're 7-0. So, but it is definitely a hard 50-50 with the women. I mean, some like the Bucks, I'm just now realizing that we're a year, we're in month 6 and the Bucks are 2-2. That's definite 50-50 booking for them. Surely the Bucks have had more than 4 matches this year, right?
So can I use this as a transition to another negative, since I have way more negatives?
Absolutely.
It pains me to say this one almost as much as JR, but and please, Dynamite Doug, don't kick me off the show.
I can't take you out. I can take you out.
I know. You can drop me like a here. The Elite don't feel quite as special as they did in New Japan and Ring of Honor, and it's improved somewhat, especially the Bucks here lately, and Kenny with his program with Hangman and all that. But for the longest time, if you weren't familiar with what made them special and such hot indie properties or big in New Japan, and I understand they are the executives behind the scenes, they're not wanting to look like they're putting themselves over. I think to this point, they've been a little too conservative because, again, if you weren't familiar with a Kenny Omega or a Young Bucks and you just turned on Wednesday night, you might be impressed with the athleticism you see, but between the records, the way they're booked, the fact that the Bucks have never even been close to those tag team belts, and Kenny hasn't really been the main singles guy the way he was in every other promotion he was in, you might wonder what all the fuss was about. And I understand you don't want to fall into the trap of the booker putting himself over, but I think if anything, they've maybe erred on the side of caution too much. Cody's the exception. They book him strong. Everyone else, what you think of as the traditional members of the Elite, when you think of the Bucks and Omega, they actually had more of an aura to them in New Japan and Ring of Honor. All is not lost. These guys are so supremely talented. There's still plenty of time to change that, but it is something I would actually like to see change.
I would like to see more of the New Japan Elite. I would, but then I think that I don't think that's them anymore. I think there is a recognition that they are building a future and building a company, and they could totally put themselves over, and they can definitely still bring it just like they did in New Japan. Because you look at the Elite Civil War, or whatever you want to call it, where we had Hangman and Omega versus the Bucks in that tag team championship match. That is hands down a 6-star tag team match. Probably, still my match of the year to this point. But so they can still bring it, but I think they are very conservative about what they're doing and how they're booking themselves. And eventually I think Cody will drop that TNT, and I didn't call it the TNA title this time, that TNT title to someone very special after he builds it up and makes that title a very, very big deal.
Very big deal. All right. You got me a segue into a positive. I'm going to hit a couple here because I don't have a lot of notes on the positives, and I think I can get a few together. meaningful title reigns.
Mm.
That's definitely a positive. You're saying he's going to drop it when it means something. Chris
Mm-hmm.
Jericho held that belt for a long time. They've
Yes.
had 2 world champions in their whole year. WWE can go through that in a month. It definitely gives credence to what they're trying to do, and that's another positive of mine, and that's that legitimate sports feel. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of rankings and win-loss records and meaningful title reigns, all of that is old school professional wrestling, less about soap opera-ish storylines and more about making it feel like a real sport. All that together, those title reigns, win-loss records, the sports feel, the long-term booking is another positive I have as a separate thing,
Yeah.
but you can tie that in as well, that they're building to something down the line. You're now talking about what's going to happen when Cody has this title built up and drops it to make a star, because they've probably thought it out that far. They may even have in mind who they want to eventually christen that sort of thing. And that's the sort of thing that gets lost in a WWE when they're going, 9 hours of whatever it is, a week of original programming. It makes it difficult.
So let me dovetail into that with some additional. Oh, that's not my notes. That's the WWE or AEW rankings, because we're talking about that sports feel, and I think they do a really good job about using the old guard to kind of push that narrative too. Because with Arn Anderson, Arn is the coach of the Nightmare family. He's not a manager; he's a coach. You've got Tully working as a coach. You've got Jake now working as a coach. I really like that where we're using the old guard to put over this new talent. As coaches, they're coaching them. I mean, Arn I think has the more sports feel throughout all of them as being the coach of the Nightmare family, but Jake kind of leans, and Tully does too, to a certain extent, lean more towards like an old school manager, but they're still kind of like coaches or advisors. I don't know that anyone's been referred to as a manager yet in AEW. If they have, I'm missing it, I guess. But
and that kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about, like, people will turn through the channels and see, hey, I remember that guy. But instead of that guy being in the ring 20 years past his prime, you're going to remember, oh man, I love Jake the Snake, and Jake the Snake's going to make you believe in Lance Archer. It's a wonderful way to get both those tricky things that we were talking about earlier, of a mix of the guys that you recognize and the new guys that are the new stars, and you put them together, and that's a wonderful way to use older talent. You're 100% right. I didn't have that on my list, but that's definitely a big positive. Go ahead.
I think I have one more positive, and I think I've exhausted my misses. Yeah. So what do you got?
Let me throw you out there then.
All right.
Real quick, because I know we're running long. Tell the affiliates we're going to run long.
Oh, yep, we are running long. We usually hit about 45 minutes. We may go an hour tonight, folks.
It's improved, but I still think that they can occasionally be too spot heavy. Particularly those first few months, nearly every match at some point was going to feature the same over the top rope suicide dive.
Tope suicida.
And I love big spots too, but after a while they get numbing and don't have as much meaning. It has gotten better, but I still think they can improve it by slowing down some and selling more. I think by including guys like FTR on your roster who are going to ground and pound and slow guys down, if you get a few more acts like that into the mix, the matches will start to differentiate themselves a little bit more. And so I think that that's one area that could be improving, and so it may be coming off of my list. Along those same lines, as something else I had here in my notes. Well, let me get to my last positive. That way I can get back to just the nitpickingness. But a lot of my negatives, I think, can be addressed, and that is a positive of mine that I'm putting on my list, is that AEW has shown, more so than WWE does typically, a willingness to change course to improve. I thought when AEW started, they had a very weak women's division after promising that they were going to really focus on the women. And now they have with Britt and, Sheeta and Nala, now they have a credible women's division. At first they didn't. I thought that they had made a lot of production mistakes in the early going that you would see that didn't make them look as major league as maybe they should, missed camera angles, bad sound, just rough edges with the announce team that I was talking about with JR. All those things have improved. So they seem as almost if they notice these problems too and are willing to change course, which sometimes Vince McMahon will show that he'll just double down on a mistake and just keep hammering it in until he can convince you it's not a mistake. Whereas AEW gives me promise that some of these things I'm complaining about, and I don't want it to seem like I'm just have all these complaints because I don't like the product. I think that I like the product so much that I think some of this stuff is things that they will fix. I think that the roster needs thinning. And I know that might be a bad thing to say at this time when you have so much talent being let go from WWE, but AEW is not WWE. They don't have that 9 hours of original programming every week. They have the Wednesday night show. They have AEW Dark. And I think that there are some folks on the roster that are not quite ready for prime time. Marco Stunt is like funny the first couple of times, and then he just kind of is a Hornswoggle type character to me. I know you like Darby Allin. I think the coffin drop looks cool, but I think I could take Darby Allin in a fight, and maybe Marco Stunt could as well. I mean, I just don't buy him as legitimate. I think that maybe it's his look too. He has like some sort of leotard and shorts on. It's just kind of an indie wrestler look that I think that maybe if they just packaged him differently.
What have you called that before? You said they still have a whiff of the indies about them.
Yeah, the indie wrestler feel. You go to your local gym and they're wrestling in tennis shoes and they don't have real gear. He doesn't look like he's wearing real gear. Private Party are insanely talented, but you're wrestling in like purple coattails and things that just kind of looks like an indie gimmick and not a national broadcast gimmick. You have guys that kind of take up space like a Luther or a Jimmy Havoc, who, to me is just like a certain type of wrestler that maybe if you only have 2 hours to feature guys, you don't necessarily need them. And I won't even get into poor Sean Spears, who I think is incredibly talented, but Ty Dillinger left WWE for the way he was being booked and positioned. And then he comes to AEW to be booked pretty much the same way, very similarly, where the fans kind of like him, but he, can't seem to win more often than he loses. So I think that if they focused it around some guys, and maybe that goes also to they only have so much time. That's another miss of mine, Doug. And then I'll end with this one and see what other misses you have, because I have just 3 or 4 more myself. But AEW Dark is an opportunity. If you have this many guys on the roster, you should be able to use your secondary show, even if it is just on your YouTube channel, to have a couple of meaningful matches, highlight some different guys. They do that to an extent, but sometimes it's 90 minutes of squash matches, literally 90 minutes of nothing but squash matches. And I know I've said I like an occasional squash match, but if you only have 2 programs and one of them is all squashes, you should at least have a main event or a semi-main event and main event on a 90-minute program that does a little more to get the main guys over. And it just seems like that's one of those things that could definitely use fixing and improve.
So David Poole has some comments on the roster being too big. And, I think jumps are inevitable. I mean, not necessarily during this global pandemic, but once things get back to some sort of normalcy, I think we are going to see, like you said, it's not necessarily because WWE is better, but because some guys might have the potential for airtime. Agreed, because I don't see a lot of, unless Mox goes back, Jericho goes back. I don't see a lot of people going to what we once considered the main roster, going straight to Raw or SmackDown. A lot of this talent would, and they could make a big deal about that, is going that this talent, if they were to jump ship, going back over to NXT, because then they're, butting heads, and you get back in, you get a little bit of that flair for the Monday Night Wars again, except, we're on Wednesdays then. But
which I do. I love that part of it. Sometimes I'll watch one and then watch the other, and depending on what the card is, I'll flip it or I'll go back and forth. So that part feels good. But you're right. WWE just has more room to spread guys out, and when you only have so much time, I don't want Luther or I don't want Billy Gunn on my TV as often as he's been in matches.
Right. He's just Billy right now because WWE owns the gun.
And this is another miss of mine, if you're going to have those squash matches, though, make them truly squash matches. I have seen too many 10-minute plus matches where a John Moxley or a Kenny Omega has difficulty putting away somebody you've never heard of before and likely won't again. On the last NXT pay-per-view, they took one of their main eventers, Tommaso Ciampa, and had him lose in a matter of minutes to make a star out of Cross.
And that is how you do that. That is how you do that.
It shouldn't take John Moxley or Kenny Omega 10, 15 minutes to beat a guy with an 0-8 record. Every now and then, that's fine to show that, man, this guy might be something and be underrated. But almost all their squash matches are back and forth.
I do like the back and forth in that sometimes the squash matches are a little bit more, and I somewhere in the back of my mind there's this hope of, oh, they're going to do something with this dude down the road, and maybe that's just some incredibly long-term booking, but as of yet I haven't seen that happen. But because that's an exciting thing, and maybe that's the mark in me going, oh, this is something that shouldn't be happening. My brain is saying, no, this should already be over and done with. So there's something special going on here, but then it never really pans out that way. But I see that. I totally see that.
And I'm sorry. I got two more negatives.
It's okay. I was going back through my negatives. I did have a bit in here about the women's division and talking as far as a negative, because I don't think it started out as strong as it could have, especially with the talent that they had. But and it kind of swings back around what you're talking about their willingness to actually course correct, because we had our big stable in the women's division with the Nightmare Collective with Brandy Rhodes, and we had Awesome Kong, and then they start to collect their members, but that was going nowhere. It was almost like the female Dark Order, and they were willing to and I think that's pretty big that they were willing to pull the plug on that, considering that Brandy Rhodes was involved with it. But they recognized this isn't going anywhere and pulled that back. And I think they are doing much better with their women's division than what I would have expected at the start.
I think they need to tighten up the rules. I know I've talked about that before. If you're the sports like league and you have rankings and win-loss records, you should also make sure people hold on to the tag ropes, that they don't take 8 minutes outside. I know all wrestling federations are bad at this, so I'm not just picking on them, but I'd like to see them. I'd like to see them fix that. And the last negative I have, Doug, is that, and this is something else I think they'll fix, and I think it's just a matter of taking what they have available to them, but their pay-per-view model is currently not really all that user-friendly. I know someone can argue you're going to get what you pay for, but it doesn't negate the fact that when the industry leader has set the value of a pay-per-view being for $9.99, you can get the pay-per-view and all this other stuff, to expect people to go back to, purchasing pay-per-views at, $30, $40, makes your product not seen as much as it should be. And I think that once they have a model in place, that they could do something similar. I mean, even Ring of Honor has their Honor Club where they, offer their pay-per-views for a low set price through their own platform. I think eventually AEW probably will get their own platform, but right now that has to be seen as a bit of a negative, that the casual fan doesn't find them as easy to access or as affordable to access.
See, now I do have that as actually the pay-per-view schedule, it being a reasonable pay-per-view schedule, because it doesn't break the bank, because you're not going to get the WWE $9.99 a month to get all the pay-per-views and have a pay-per-view every month. But for those people out there for some reason who chose not to go with the WWE, they're still paying for those pay-per-views, and maybe they're doing a hit and miss throughout the year and getting what they want and picking and choosing instead of just having them all like we do where we have the network. But at least with the pay-per-view structure that they have right now, we're getting basically a pay-per-view a quarter. So we're getting like 4 big pay-per-views, which gives the storylines time to breathe. So you can do more of that long-term booking, which I really, really do like. But I would not complain at all if we got something like Honor Club for AEW, or, if we could get, $9.99 a month for their service once they build up enough of a catalog to start offering something like that. That would be great.
I think they will, because I think that they took this deal now, but I think they would have. I love the schedule. I'm fine with the schedule, but I think as far as ease of access and cost goes, that once they have their own platform, they can push people to. I think that's something that they'll probably do. Yeah. I'm out of negatives. But I had 2 things as far as the things I'd like to see. Do you have anything for that, Doug? Anything
I'd like to see a belt on a Hager at some point before the end of the year. Don't care what kind of belt he has, but and I would also like to see that Hager jersey on Pro Wrestling Tees.
That didn't do that, did they?
They did not. Those were one-offs just for the Stadium Stampede, just
You'd
for
be
the
wearing them by now if
wrestlers.
they had that.
I would
So
wear that all the time.
the one thing, Doug, and the first one I think I've kind of already talked about some of the things that I think that they are working on. I won't get into that because of time. But one thing I want to mention that I think I'd like to see is insurance for the talent. As a talent-run organization, there was a lot of talk as AEW was coming together that they were going to be talent-friendly and there would be talent-friendly perks that would change the industry, things that WWE wasn't actively doing for its talent. And there is some misconception out there in some circles that AEW actually offers healthcare to wrestlers under contract, and that's incorrect. The only wrestlers that receive healthcare insurance right now at AEW are those that actually work in the office. So
Right.
it's Cody, the Young Bucks, Kenny, Christopher Daniels. Tony Khan and the Elite have always been a little cagey when they talk about health insurance. Khan refers a lot to helping wrestlers find ways to contribute to AEW in full-time roles so that they're working in the office so that they could be eligible for benefits. Because the truth is that if they just offered health insurance just to their wrestlers, it would upset the business model they currently have. But that was one thing, that and unions seem to be the two wrestlers always have against the way that they've been featured for years in the other promotions. And I'd love to see AEW actually fulfill on that promise and be able to do that for its talent.
Yeah, that would be great. Maybe someday.
If you're ready to go to the big finish, we could probably get through this fast.
Big finish. Big
else?
finish. There we go. Big finish. What do you got this week for the big finish?
Embarrassment of the week. I can be real brief on this because I belabored it. Folks, if you didn't see our show last week and you wanted to hear me go on and on about cinematic wrestling and Street Profits versus Viking Raiders, Doug and I gave a pretty detailed review. That was obviously an embarrassing thing to see as a wrestling fan and try to explain to anyone who's not a wrestling fan. That's the worst thing I saw this week.
I have to agree with you 100%. And if you want a really colorful breakdown of that, I encourage you to go out and find Jim Cornette's podcast where he touches on this. You'll get a very interesting take on it. That's pretty similar to what Kevin and I had on it, but yeah, just in a lot more colorful language.
I haven't heard it, but I imagine he's not as safe with his words as we are.
He is not at all.
Doug, what was your favorite match of the last week?
You know what? Sometimes it's hard for me to catch all the wrestling that there is in a week, and I was scrambling to get caught up, and I'm going to have to go with the Styles Riddle match that was just on SmackDown, and not because it was like a 5-6 star match or anything like that, but just because it set the tone of what can happen on SmackDown now that we have the original Bro on SmackDown. I mean, it wasn't a bad match, but it wasn't, again, not a 5-6 star match, but it was a great match to just establish where things can go with Matt Riddle on that show now.
I had as my match of the week the Orton Edge match that headlined last week's pay-per-view. I know it was slightly different in that it was, parts of it were, cinematically cut in. But for the most part, for a match that I wanted to ridicule for a month because of the way they promoted it, they not only made me overcome the ridicule I had for it. By the end, I was hanging on everything they were doing. I think it'll, how can you rank it as the best match of all time before it even happens? You can't.
Right.
How can you rank anything as the best match? Because that's always subjective, which, by the way, will lead into our next week's topic. We'll do that in a moment. But they did a great job, and I love that match. Doug, what was your performance of the week?
I will tell you, I have in my notes for my performer of the week, Britt Baker heel Britt Baker is a gift to us from the wrestling gods. I love the bit where Big Swole takes off with her. We later find her in a dumpster. She's yelling at her valet with banana peel on her head. I just love heel Britt Baker, and she just nailed it this week. So
she gets more comfortable every single week. She's fantastic. And I'm glad you mentioned her. I'm glad you mentioned Matt Riddle because I so wanted to give it to him, as a performer of the week to show what kind of impact you can make on a night one. I wanted to give it to a Ricky Starks who made such an impact coming on to AEW and Cody doing almost what Styles did, just showing this guy's going to be a star for us. But I think there's going to be moments I can give down the road to a Matt Riddle and a Ricky Starks. But so tonight I'm going to give it to a 70-plus-year-old man, and who knows how many more chances I will have to say the dirtiest player in the game, Ric Flair, on Monday night showed why he is still the greatest to have ever done it. He had me completely forgetting about the Evolution tie. I just thought he was being the kindly veteran trying to help Christian out. And then boom, low blow, Orton. I thought it was just a great piece of heel work and shows why Rick is so adored by those of us who remember him in his prime.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, dirtiest player in the game. Always will be.
And Doug, if you've got nothing else, we've just set a record. We just hit the little over the hour mark. But folks, we had a heavy news night, and hopefully you enjoyed the discussion on AEW. Thank you for chiming in. We got another great show next week. Doug, you want to tell them what we're doing next week at 8?
What are we doing next week? Are we doing our greatest matches ever? What are we
Greatest
doing?
matches ever. Obviously, it's subjective. So you guys be thinking about what are some of your favorite matches. Next week, Doug and I, knowing it's subjective, we're going to lay out for you what we think are some of the greatest matches in the history of this sport.
So that will be interesting to see where you got to hear me gush about AEW all this week. So I wonder how many of the elite will be on my list. Wait, comments. And that's cool. You have every right to your opinion. I mean, even if it's wrong, you have every right to your opinion.
I'll say this: no matter which order you put those two in, those are the two best shows on television. Right?
Absolutely, without a doubt.
So I appreciate the fact that everyone joined us for our talk about one of the best wrestling programs on TV right now. Even with things that they have to improve, AEW has changed the wrestling landscape for the better, unquestionably. And we're lucky to have them around. We're lucky to have you guys watching, and we hope you tune in next week.
So until next week, I've been Doug.
And I've been Kevin.
We've been talking wrestling. Good night, everybody. Oh, and happy Father's Day to the fathers out there.
Happy Father's Day.